Oh boy, I know, I'm gonna get some crap for this one, but it's probably because you're going to misunderstand the title or the point I'm trying to make, so let me just clarify from the beginning. I'm not trying to say that range is unimportant, or that range is pointless, or that you shouldn't think about range at all. Range in electric vehicles is a very important question, and a lot of people have that when they're first approached to EVs, but my point is range is overrated, and a lot of the time I do mean that literally. Like, people put too much value, essentially, in what is the range of this electric car. But I think the question inherently is fundamentally flawed when you start to unpack that. You know, I've been driving lots of friends and family members in my Tesla Model 3, and that is an inevitable question that always comes up. But what I think they're actually really asking isn't so much what is the EPA rated range of this vehicle. They're more thinking with your typical gas car mindset, and I'm not blaming them, by the way. They're not wrong to ask this thing. But what they're asking is, how often do you have to stop? Like, how far can it go before you have to charge up again? And the reason I say that that's fundamentally flawed is because we charge our electric vehicles very, very differently than what we refuel our gas vehicles with. And I think people tend to oversimplify EVs a lot because they're so different and they have so many variances that people probably don't even think about, because they just think, oh yeah, battery instead of gas tank, and now you go to charge station instead of gas station, charge station slow, gas station fast, therefore EVs are worse. But like, how we drive around our gas vehicles is, okay, you can go, some gas cars are like 350 or 400, or our old gas car goes 500 miles on a single tank, and you know, it depends on how you're driving it and what your miles per gallon is, but once you drive that 500 miles, okay, now we got to stop, look around for a gas station, okay, let's fill up here, and then we can keep driving for however long it takes for us to drive that long. Whereas with an EV, at least the vast majority of charging is still done at home, which means that you wake up to a full tank every single day, and even if you're not able to charge from home or you're doing a road trip, the charge stops are very rarely ever to full. Pretty much the way battery chemistry fundamentally works, whether it's an iron-based cathode or it's a nickel-based cathode, you charge at a faster rate when you're at a low state of charge going up towards 60-70%, and then once you get up there, that's when the charging speed tends to taper off, and electric vehicles are programmed to account for this and say, alright, you've charged up to a high enough state that you can make it to your next stop. So when you're road tripping, you're very rarely getting to that full 100% charge anyway. And on top of that, the electric vehicle range is not going to be what the EPA states when you're road tripping in the first place. So this is another reason why I think the question of, well, how far does it go on a charge, is fundamentally flawed, right? Because if you're just doing daily city driving, you know, running some errands, picking up groceries, or dropping off the kids at school, most Americans are not driving more than 40 miles a day. Sure, we could double that for the sake of the example. Let's say, all right, let's go a little further, 80 miles of driving a day. So that's double the average, and still, pretty much even the worst EV range is still going to be able to cover 80 miles. And then you'll probably be able to top off from home at the end of the day. Even with a slow 110 outlet, charging up overnight, you can cover your driving habits that way. So the main reason I think people are asking about range is more so in those situations of, okay, well, what if I'm driving a great distance? Well, that's when your actual range number is going to be a lot worse than what the EPA states anyway, because most electric vehicles, with a few exceptions, tend to get worse range at highway speed, because that's when aerodynamics starts to play into more of a factor, and you use a lot more energy traveling at high speed. But when we talk about range in our EVs, we tend to list the EPA estimate, and the EPA is using a combination of city driving and highway driving. So once you're at that high speed, unless you have a vehicle that is like a Porsche Taycan, where they have like a 2-speed transmission to optimize for better highway range, but most EVs don't have that, you're not going to get that promised EPA figure when you're doing a road trip. The much bigger variable that I think absolutely impacts your total trip time and how often you're going to stop is your charging network. How many DC fast charging stops are you going to have to make, and how many DC fast charging stalls are available? Like, are you going to be waiting in line at a supercharger, or is Electrify America down, or is your vehicle, like a Chevy Bolt, going to max out at 50 kilowatts, or is your vehicle going to max out at 250 kilowatt charge speed? That dictates how long your stop is, that dictates how many stops there are, and the availability of those chargers. All of these things, of course, as well as the temperature. Are you cruising at 75 miles per hour or 65 miles per hour? That's going to impact your range all the time too. And on top of all of those variables that are going to impact your road trip tripping range, we haven't even talked about battery degradation yet. So the average American tends to own the vehicle for 6 to 8 years, and honestly, I think with electric vehicles having less moving parts and less things to service in regards to oil changes or transmission, I could be wrong, but I think that in the future, most EV owners are probably going to own their car more than 8 years. But the truth is, whether you have lithium iron phosphate or you have nickel-based batteries, batteries degrade over time, unlike gas tanks, which tend to pretty much hold the same amount of gas, and the gas engine tends to have pretty similar miles per gallon no matter how long you own the vehicle. Might get a little bit worse over time, but not as much as a battery does. And I'm not saying that's like a deal breaker with EVs, but my point is within the first year or two of electric vehicle ownership, that's where you see the most amount of degradation. That's where the first couple cycles start lowering the max capacity of the battery pack. And yeah, it tends to stable out. If you don't believe me, check out lots of Tesla channels online that have reviewed their Model 3s. After 120 or some of them 200,000 miles, they still have pretty decent battery health, typically around 85 to 90% battery health after driving hundreds of thousands of miles. So it's not like, oh no, the battery's dead, but it does absolutely impact your 100% range number. So maybe you don't believe me and say, well, Drew, because of my route, I'm gonna always charge my vehicle straight up to 100%. But my point is, for the majority of that vehicle ownership, that 100% range number isn't really even gonna be hit, even if you do miraculously hit your EPA estimated range numbers. After a few years of ownership, you're gonna be a few dozen miles below that 100% range number anyway. So while battery chemistries are getting better at managing their cycle life, and I don't think that this means like all electric vehicles are gonna need replacement high voltage battery packs after just a couple years of ownership. No, they'll last a long time. I just think when people are weighing out which EV to buy and they say, well, this one has 300 miles or this one has 270 miles of range, this one has 330, or wait a minute, this one has 350, you're all just getting obsessed over that very rarely achieved 100% first year of ownership range figure, which you don't hit at highway speed anyway. Which is why, again, I'm not trying to say that range is unimportant, it's just that we're putting too much value in that one number. And I think that once you get past the 250 mile range figure or so, once you're above that, what's more important than thinking about, should I get the one with 350 miles of range or 330, or maybe I could get by with 300? That amount of difference in range is going to fluctuate heavily depending on the elevation, the degradation, the temperature outside, the speed at which you drive. There's so many other variables that are going to impact your range that, to me, that difference in numbers is all mostly semantics. I feel like it would be a different discussion if it was like Aptera and you're trying to decide, well, do I want a 400 mile range EV or a 1,000 mile range EV? It's like, okay, now you've just increased by a huge volume how many places you can travel to without stopping at all. Okay, there's like a difference of 400 to 600 miles of range. Yeah, that's a pretty big difference in what trips you can take without stopping. But if we're talking about a difference of 30 to 50 miles, there's like pretty big rounding changes that are going to be made depending on the conditions of your drive and how your battery pack ages over time. So despite the fact that the EPA test cycle is probably the most accurate out of all of the different range testing cycles we've seen, it's still not that accurate, and Teslas tend to not hit that number while other EVs get a bit closer. But ultimately, I still think that Tesla's main advantage isn't that the EPA range number is higher, it's that the supercharging network is super reliable, super plentiful, so there's plenty of places for you to stop, and all of them tend to charge up pretty quickly and have stalls that are online. And that's the biggest problem with the non-Teslas, not so much that their range numbers isn't as good. And that's why I think Lucid is struggling from demand issues. Even though they've got the highest range numbers, and lots of people claim that, well, range is king, whoever's got the best range is gonna win. Well, the highest range electric vehicle is struggling to sell because it's not that important after a certain point, and the charging network you rely on is really gonna limit your trip time anyway, regardless of if you can go 500 miles on a charge. People tend to want to stop for bathroom breaks and food anyway. So I find it interesting that if you go back far enough, you'll find that Tesla used to display highway range versus city range. Like back in 2013, 2014, they used to separate those range numbers, but they probably realized that it just gets a little confusing and kind of admits that EV range is not that good at highway speed, so maybe that was worse for sales. But I don't see any other company that's trying to come forward with a, let's give a two separate range number mark, even if that's more honest. But what I think is a better indication of why range is overvalued is it's like never talked about in the gas car business. Like, how many gas vehicle commercials have you seen that talk about how far far that gas vehicle can go on a single tank. Like, they never talk about that. It's always the miles per gallon. It's always how efficient the vehicle is. That's what matters more so than the max range. And the reason we don't care about our gas vehicle's max range figures is because we know there's gas stations everywhere. And I feel fairly similar about electric vehicles because we know we can charge from home. So we don't have to go looking for a gas station or go to a different one based on which is cheaper. We're going to be charging from home. And if we're going on road trips, the car, at least if it's a good one, will have pre-route planning and tells you, here's where you can stop and charge next. And here's how long it'll take to charge there. Here's how many stalls are available. The car is doing that planning for you. So you don't have to think like, oh, I hope there's a charge station where we end up. Just like how with gas vehicles, because gas stations are so plentiful, you don't really have to plan for it. You can just say, whenever we're in the next town, there will probably be a gas pump there. So if you're buying a vehicle that's intelligently designed like that and has the software for battery preconditioning and it has the fast charging capability, you don't really need to worry that much about range. That's not really a huge factor impacting trip time more so than traffic does or temperature does or elevation does. And the car, at least with Teslas, should be pretty good at estimating what your range is going to be based on your climate, based on your elevation, based on your driving speed. And that's why it gives you lots of different energy data that tells you how to save more range and what tips you can implement to go greater distances between those charging stops. So hopefully that was a bit insightful, and I hope that you can bring some of that knowledge to other people that are curious about EVs in the future and asking about range and how much range they really need. And thank you to everybody supporting this channel over on Patreon. It seriously helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. Have an excellent rest of your day.